Welcome to another video tutorial. In this video, we're going to take a quick look at how to make a post-load mechanic into RPG in a Box, because this is something that by default is not built into RPG in a Box. This is something we have to add ourselves. So what do I mean by post-load mechanic? So in RPG in a Box, you have the ability to both save a game and load a game, okay? Now, in a minute, I'm going to explain how both of those functions work. Now, obviously, it should be pretty self-explanatory. One saves the game, the other loads it. But there's a couple of things to bear in mind when it comes to how they work, because it leads to this issue we have with post-load. So it's a commonly asked question on the Discord, how to have something happen after you load a game. You might want to set a property to true or set it to something, or you might want to have something happen in the game after you load the game, whether it be a message appear, or whether a character gets added to the map or something like that, or player changes character or something. Or maybe it could be that something is not restoring properly. So, you've saved a game and then you load your game, but the wrong textures are being set on a model or something like that. So you want to be able to both load the game, but also then restore the textures back to what they should have been when you saved the game. So we need a way to be able to have something happen after you load a game. But the problem is, by default, RPG in a Box does not do that. So we have to do that ourselves. So let me quickly, first of all, take a few moments just to explain a couple of important things to note about how saving and loading work in RPG in a Box. So for this, I've got a quick example script. It doesn't do anything. It's just for example, just to show you some code. And I can talk about how save game and load game work. So let's imagine we've got this code here. And what it does, a couple of pointless things. It just displays a message, hello world, adds a fake object, in this case, something I call chair, to a coordinate. So imagine it spawns a chair somewhere. And then it sets a global property. In this case, the property is called name, and it sets it to Alan. Okay, so it sets it to the string Alan. Then what it does is this script then saves the game. Okay, so that will now create a save point in time. Okay, then what the script does after it's saved the game is it then displays another message, in this case saying the game was saved. And then it changes the global property that we set earlier to Alan, and then changes it to James. Now you might be wondering, why are you changing it immediately afterwards to James? That's to illustrate the difference between save game and load game. Okay, if we take a look at the example script down below, we just uncomment it, you can see it's pretty much identical. The only difference, I'm also going to change the text because it's not relevant in this case, it's loaded. The only difference besides that is it's using load game rather than save game, okay? So let's talk about this. So what happens is, in this script, it's going to show a message, add an object, set a property to Alan, save the game, show another message, and then set the property to something else, in this case, James, okay? So that's our save script. Now let's imagine in a completely separate file, not the same one, so this is actually in a different file. Let's imagine we had this code, and this code displays a message, adds an object, sets a global property to something, and then loads the previous save game, this one here. So we saved the game earlier, and then this is a request to load the game back to this point here. Now, when you save a game, it stores where you are in terms of the game, so what map you're on. It should store what quests you've completed. It should store what global properties have been set to. It should store entity properties. It should store widget text. It should store inventory, equipment, all those sorts of things. There are obviously some situations where some things are not either saved or restored properly, and that's one of the reasons why it's a common question on how can you do things after a load game. But for the most part, save game should save most, if not, most, because it's clearly not doing all, but it should save most of the important game status stuff. Okay, so that's what this save game is going to do. It's going to save the map you're on, the items in your inventory, the equipment you've got, what your widget text and stuff is, what quests you've got, what items you've got, what properties you've got set, etc, etc, etc. Now, when we get to this script file where we're showing a message, we're adding an object, and then we're setting a property, we're then requesting that we load game. Now, what this is going to do, this is going to act like a time machine. Okay, this is setting a point in time where we want our game to rewind to. Okay, and then this is the rewind button. So this is like, if you can remember, if you're old enough to remember a VHS tape, right? This is the rewind button. You're literally rewinding the video back to a point in time where you set the checkpoint to. Okay, if you can remember DVDs, it's like pressing the back on the DVD button. You're going back to a previous chapter, and this is where you're setting what the chapters are, the chapter points, right? Or if you're more familiar with emulation, then this is the save state, and then this is a restore state. Okay. Now, there's two important things to note about that, and the reason why I bring that up. First of all, any script that has a load game request in it will stop at this point. So it's going to stop here, and it's not going to do any more. So having these two lines underneath is going to be pointless, because this particular file, this script, is going to stop here. So anything below here, if you've got lots of things, let's say you even had an if check, if then end, and you've got lots of stuff going on in here, none of that is going to happen, because the script is going to stop the moment it hits a load game request. Because when it hits a load game request, it's just going to press the rewind button, which means the script that's currently being executed is going to stop, and it's going to rewind. Okay, it's going to go back down the timeline to where the last save point was. Now, so that's the first thing to understand, is any script that has a load game in it, it needs to be the last thing your script does. So set anything, do anything you want it to do, and then load the game at the end. Because anything after this, if you've got anything afterwards, it's not going to work. Okay, it's not going to execute, because the script will have stopped. Okay, because it has to stop in order to go back in time. Okay. And the other important thing to note about that is that data that gets changed after this point that isn't saved will also be rewound. Okay, because you think about it, if you think about watching a VHS or a DVD or whatever, right? If you press the rewind button, then scenes that have yet to happen are not going to have happened, because you've gone back in the film to a point in time where those things haven't happened. So it's very much the case here. When you hit a load game and it goes back to a point where you had a save game, anything that happens afterwards where you didn't then save the game afterwards are going to be lost. So for example, we have this global property named Alan. We save the game and then we change it to James. Well, when we, let's ignore this and say we weren't changing it in this script. Okay, so we're setting it to James. And then later on in our script, we haven't saved it again, but we hit the load game. It's actually going to go back to here, and it's going to lose the James, and it's going to put it back to Alan, because it was Alan when you saved it. So anything that you want to keep should be done before you save the game. Otherwise, when you hit a load game, it's going to undo the things that have happened afterwards. So, that's really important to bear in mind, okay? So, in order to implement our and the other thing to mention, of course, is there's no current inbuilt way in the engine for the game to detect that you've loaded, that you've gone back in time. And that's part of the problem, is because how do you get your game to recognize that you've now pressed the rewind button and you've gone back to this point in time? There currently is no inbuilt way within the interface to assign a script to that event. There is no such event as onloaded. There should be, and hopefully in future iterations of RPG in a Box that will eventually come around, because I think it would be very useful. But for now, we can at least do this ourselves, and this is what this video is going to be about. It's going to show you one such way you could go about implementing such a mechanic. And to do so, what we're going to do is we're actually going to sort of abuse the fact that load game works the way it does, that it stops other scripts from continuing. With the moment it hits a load game, we're going to use that fact. And we're also going to use the fact that it doesn't restore, it doesn't keep properties what they were after a save game. This will make more sense when we get to implementing it. But before we do anything, one last thing I want to stress before we start, okay? If you're considering using this mechanic, there's one important thing you need to be aware of, and that's that you cannot use the inbuilt main menu, okay? This is the menu that when you're in, because obviously there's no save game on the main menu because you're not in a game yet, right? But what I'm talking about is when you press escape, when you're playing your game, if you're using the default menu and then it has this kind of menu pops up with save game in it, we can't use that menu because what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to write a custom save game script. We're going to need to change the way the game actually saves games in order for the load mechanic to work, okay? So you've got two choices ahead of you. You can either make your own custom main menu and refer to my custom main menu video tutorial if you want to follow that and learn how to make a menu like this, for example. Or what you can do is you can forego the menu entirely. You can go to game configuration, go to user interface, turn the main menu off like I've done because I need to for my custom menu. But then you could turn this off but not make a menu at all, in which case your game would just load immediately. The game would start the moment you run it. You wouldn't get a main menu, it would just go straight into the first map the moment you run it. But also, what you can then do is go to the game configuration, go to the input bindings, and set up a couple of keys, one for a custom script, which we're going to make in a minute for our save game, and then another one that loads game, okay? And then what you can do is communicate to the player that if they press this button, it will save the game, and if they press this button, it will load the game. Kind of like a quick save, quick load type system. So you could do that as another way you could do it. But you have to have a custom system, whether it's key bindings or whether it's a menu. You can't use the inbuilt main menu because the save menu that you'll get with this is only going to save the game. And we need to be a little bit more sophisticated than that if we want to keep track of the fact that we're now loading a previous point in time. Okay? So with that said, now we can get to the tutorial part of this where I explain how to set up a custom post-load mechanic. And for this, I'm actually going to use my custom menu from my custom menu tutorial. I've loaded up that project again. So what we'll do is we'll change the save game button that I've currently got here, and we'll write a different script and we'll assign it to this button that's going to do our custom saving and loading mechanic. Okay, so let's get to scripting. So the first thing we need to do is close this script, and we're going to make a new one, which we'll just call save game, let's say. Okay, and we don't need the hello world. So what we're going to do first of all is I've also gone ahead and made a global property, which I've called loaded, and it starts false, and it's a Boolean. Okay, so if you haven't got one of those, go to here, click Boolean, click add, and then name it loaded. You can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it loaded because that's what it's going to be for. Okay. So what we're going to do, the first thing in our save game script is we're going to type global.property loaded, and we're going to set it to true. So we're setting that Boolean to true. The next thing we're going to do is save the game. Okay. And then the next thing we're going to do is then set the global property to false. Now, if you're just using a input binding, input key system where you press one button and it saves and another button and it loads, this is all the code that you need. But in my case, it's part of my custom main menu, so I also need to deal with that stuff. So I also need to resume game because my escape button will pause the game to bring up my menu. So I need to resume it when you click save. I also need to hide the widgets. Now, I can't remember the names off the top of my head, so let me just quickly grab those from the function that does this. So I need those. I'm also going to grab this to explain this as well. But for now, what we'll do is we'll comment that one out. We'll come back to save data. Okay, so this is our save game script. In my case, it's going to resume the game, hide the pause menu widgets. Then it's going to set that property to true, save the game, and then set it to false. Now, you're probably thinking two questions, and if you're not, I'll present them anyway. Why are you using a loaded property in a save script? And also, why are you setting it to true and then immediately setting it to false? Both of those I'll explain in just a moment. However, both of those things should become pretty self-explanatory when we move on to the next bit. So what we need to do now is save this script, and we're going to go to our, in my case, I'm going to go to my custom pause menu. I'm going to click the save game button, change it from the script it's currently on to my new save game script. So now this button is going to do, when I save it, it's going to do this code here. Okay, so it's going to hide my widgets, resume my game, more importantly, set this property to true, then save the game, and then set it to false. Now, that will now log the fact that we have, because what we're abusing here is the fact that when we save a game, we can have something happen after we've saved a game. In this case, we can unset it to false, and I'll explain why we do that in a bit. But the reason why we're setting it to true just before is when we eventually load the game, we're going to actually be rewinded to a point in time where this was true, not false, because we set this to false after we saved the game, but we set it to true, just before we saved it. So when we then load, we're going to go back to a point in time where this is still true, and that's going to be vital for our post-load mechanic, okay? Now, the other part of the problem is not just how do we track whether we've loaded or not, but the other problem is RPG in a Box currently doesn't do anything when you load a game because there's no load event. If there was, we wouldn't have this problem. So we need to kind of make a custom event as well where the game can detect and do something. So the best way to do that is to do this in the startup script. And you need to make what's called a forever loop. Okay, and a forever loop looks like this. You type while true do, and then 2 lines down, end, semicolon. Okay, and now everything within here is just going to happen over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, so what do we want our game to do over and over and over and over and over and over again? What we want it to do is check if global.property loaded is equal to true, then what we want it to do then is, let's say, display message. Game loaded. And then this is where you would put all of your stuff that should happen after you've loaded a game. So you could have set entity texture and then put, entities to the right texture. So you'd have your entity that you want to change the texture for, and then the texture name would go there, right? This might be where you recomplete a quest if it didn't save the fact that you'd completed it. So you'd put a complete quest in here. Now, obviously, this is this one bit of code here is going to cater for every time you load a game. So obviously, you're going to need to make it so that it can be dynamic. So it can do different things based on when you saved the game stuff. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. For now, I'm just going to keep it very simple. It's going to show a message when you load a game, okay? But the second important thing to note is that once you've finished all your code for the things that should happen, the last thing you need to do is set this property. If I could type, set this property back to false. So that way, the while loop stops doing this bit because then it's done everything it needs and therefore it unsets the property. Otherwise, if you had things like if you had a script where when you load it, one of the post-load things it does is give you an item, If you didn't set this to false, then it's just going to constantly, forever, give you that item over and over and over and over again, because it's checking for it over and over and over again. So we need it at some point to be false, so it doesn't do those things. So we want it to do it once. So it does all the things when it's true and then sets it to false at the end. And then the last thing we need to do is just after the first end, press enter and type wait, and then in the brackets a number 1 and a wait a second. You have to have a wait inside a while loop, especially a forever loop, because if you don't, it will crash the engine, because you're getting it to basically do constantly something over and over and over again. And if you're not telling the game to pause at least a little bit while it's doing that, then it crashes. So just put the wait in there for 2 reasons. First of all, it stops the while loop from crashing, but also this number, the duration, the period of wait, is important, and we'll get to that in a minute. So, believe it or not, that's all we need to do, okay? If we go into game now and we test it, so here we are in game, my custom main menu. If I click new game, so here we are in the first map. So let's save somewhere where we know where we are. So let's save ourselves right next to the barrel, okay? So I'm going to press escape, which brings up my pause menu, and here's my save game button. So clicking this should resume the game, hide these widgets, set that property loaded to true, then save the game, and then immediately set it to false. Okay, so there's our save game. So we can continue playing, but we've now stored the fact that we were standing just here beside this barrel. So let's go move across the bridge and go stand somewhere else. Let's say over here, okay? Now if we press escape and we hit the load game script, that button, it's going to load the game back to where we were standing by the barrel. But what it's also going to do is it's going to load back to a previous time where the global property loaded was true. So let's see what happens. And now we get a game loaded message appear. So this means that our game is now picking up the fact that we have loaded, and it's doing something specific for that moment. Okay, this message did not appear at any other time other than when we loaded the game. So if I do that again, we get the game loaded. So every time you load a game, it's now picking up the fact that you've loaded a game, which now means you can use this to do something when you load a game. So once you've finished loading, you can have something happen. So let me just quickly explain how this is kind of working if you're still a bit confused as to how this is working. So if we go to our save game script, we're setting this property to true, and then we're saving the game. It's obviously the most important bit. We're setting where do we revert to when we load a game. But then the most immediate thing afterwards that we do is we set it to false. Now the reason we set it to false afterwards is so that our startup script does not do this immediately after we've saved the game, because there's going to be a moment where our startup, because it's going to be doing this all the time, there's going to be a moment where it's going to check, is this true? Well, there's a moment in time where we are setting it to true, which is just before we save the game. Now, we don't want our startup to ever do anything unless we've loaded. So what we want to do is then immediately set it to false after we've completed the save game. All of this happens very quickly, so that's why you don't really notice anything happen, because all 3 of these things should execute almost instantly. So it will set it to true, save the game, and set it to false within a nanosecond. So that's not enough time for our startup script, which is waiting a second to detect it's true and therefore do anything, okay? However, because we set this to false after we saved the game, when we then load game back to this point in time, this is going to be true again. But the difference now is that we're not running this script at the point when we load and revert back to this point in time. So this can't be changed back to false. So when you load a game, not only will it go back in time to where this is true, but it can't ever then change it from true, because no scripts are currently running at the point where we would go back to that are changing this property, right? So then our startup script will then pick up the fact that it's true, and then can therefore carry out the things that it needs to do and then set it to false afterwards, okay? So that in essence is how the post-load mechanic works. And so from here, you can just put anything you want to have happen will be restored in this if statement here, okay? But do that before you set this to false. So let's take a look at making this a bit more advanced. So a couple of things. First of all, let's uncomment this so that our save game script is also saving data, okay? So what we could do is we could save, let's say, a Boolean value. So let's say this is, a Boolean value of true, and we'll write it into a file called save data. Or maybe more practically, it might be that, you've just completed a quest, so you also want to save the quest ID. So you could have save data and then in a string quest 0001, and then the file could be called quests done or something like that, right? And let's say for whatever reason, there's a bug in your game or whatever, where it's not recognizing the fact that when you load a game, that the quests you've completed have been completed, and it's sort of acting as if they're still running. So when you post load, you want to also recomplete the quest that should have been completed when you saved, okay? So what we've got here is we've got a situation where we're saving some data, in this case a Boolean, and we're saving some data, which is a quest ID. Let's say before you even did that, let's say after you did that, you then complete quest, okay? Actually, what you would really do, just to make this more clearer, let me put a few spaces here and a few comments. So let's say this is a quest completion script. So this isn't your save game script at all. This is in a separate script file, but this is when you complete a quest, let's say. So what you're going to do is you're going to both complete the quest with the complete quest command, but you're also going to save the data with the quest ID that's been completed into a quests done file, okay? So that's what your quest completion script does, okay? And we'll ignore this for now. In fact, we don't need that. It was just to show you save data, but we're doing a different example, okay? So this is a completely separate script to this, okay? So you have to use your imagination a bit here while I explain this. So this is a completely different file to this one, okay? This is our save game button. This is our quest completion script. I'm just putting it in the same file so you can see them at the same time, okay? So imagine you reach a point in your game where you complete a quest, and what you're also doing is you're saving the ID of the quest that you've just completed, okay? And then at a later point in time, maybe not much later, but at a later point in time, you hit your save game button. So what it does is it resumes the game and hides the pause menu, sets this to true, saves the game, and it should have saved the fact that this has been completed because this happened before you hit save game, right? But let's say there's a bug for whatever reason where when you then load the game, this has not been completed. This goes back to being active for whatever reason. So what we can now do is, let's just delete this so I can compile the script again. But imagine that script is still there. The complete quest script is still there. What we can now do in our post load event is when we've detected that we have loaded, instead of showing a message, we can bring that quest ID in. So local variable quest ID equals load data, and we can bring quests done into quest ID, and that will now be the ID of the quest that we completed just before we saved the game. So now what we can do is we can then recomplete within the load game code $quest1, and that will recomplete a quest that should have been completed when you load. If that makes sense, that would be quest ID, sorry, not quest1. Okay, the variable here needs to be what you put into the complete quest, and then you would unset the global property. Yeah. So just to re-explain that again, you've got a quest completion script that completes the quest, but also stores the quest ID in case it doesn't get restored properly. Then you have your save game script, which is logging the fact that you want to be able to load back here at some point, saves the game, etc. And then your startup script, when it detects that you've loaded, it re-grabs from the data the quest ID that's in there, and then if it wasn't complete, if when you loaded it hadn't completed the quest, now you can have it recomplete that quest when you've finished loading that game. It will then do that immediately afterwards. Okay, so this is useful because you can grab future data as well. So for example, let's say you saved the game like this, okay? Because remember how I explained earlier that if we had global property name Alan and global property name James, if we go back to the example, I talked about the fact that when you use load game, it will put it back to Alan and you'll lose the fact that you set it afterwards to James, right? Well, we can get around that with data, okay? So going back to our save game script, let's say, for example, I have this script here where I have global.property name is Alan, okay? And then I save the game. And then after saving the game, what I do is I set global.property name to James. And then I type save data James into, I don't know, a file called name, prop name, let's say. And I click apply and save. What that will do is when we save the game, it will change the loaded property to false. It will also change the name from Alan to James, and it will save the data. James, it will save what we set it to afterwards. But we're doing this after we've saved the game. So with properties, you lose it when you load the game, but with data, you don't. So then when we go to our startup script, we can then bring that in. So $name equals load data prop name. And then we can set global.property name equals dollar name. Okay. So just to show you this practically, what I'm going to do, let's just make sure that compiles. Yeah. Just to show you this practically, I'm going to comment this out. Okay. And we'll just play the game normally so you can see what happens. So let's just do new game. For now, I'm just going to bring down the console. I'm going to type global.property name equals Alan. Okay. So if I print global.property Alan, name, we get Alan back, which is what it should be set to. Okay. So then when we go and stand, let's say halfway across the bridge, we press escape and we click save game. Now if we bring down the console and we reprint this property, it should be James, which it is. Okay. But now what happens when we load the game? So I hit load game. Okay. So we're back on the bridge. In fact, let's move to a different spot and then load the game again so you can see it really has loaded back to the bridge. And now we'll reprint that property again. It's Alan. So you see how it's gone back, even though we changed it afterwards and the scripts changed it to James. When we loaded, it went back to Alan. And that's because we're going back to a point in time where this is not, it hadn't been changed. Okay. Now, if we go back to our script here and we put this system back in place where we're going to, part of our post-load script is to put it back to future data. Now if we play, let's go across the bridge and let's save game. Okay, let's bring down the console and print global.property name. It's James, as it should be, because that's the last thing that our save game script does, is set it to James. Okay, but it doesn't save the game after doing that though. So when we hit load game, technically we should lose that information and it should go back to being Alan. But now if I load the game and I reprint the global property, it's still James. Okay, so even though we set it to James after we saved the game, even though we've gone back in time, we've been able to bring that future data with us. Kind of a bit like Terminator, you know, you're going back in time, but you're bringing something from the future with you. So we're bringing something that we had stored after saving, but we can also use it again when we load. That's the benefit of using data, is because data is an external reference to something, and therefore it doesn't get rewound when you load again. The data will still exist even if it's created after a point in time where you've saved, if that makes sense. Data will always exist the moment you write it, whenever you write it, okay? Unless you clear it out manually with a script or delete the file, whatever. So by saving the data that the property's been set to, even when we load game and it puts this back, we can grab the data and put it back in our post-load script. Okay. So anyway, I think I've explained enough of how this mechanic works. Very simply though, in order to use it, it's just a startup script that has a while loop that's checking if a loaded variable is true. And if it is, do the things you want to do and then set it to false. Make sure there's a wait so your while loop doesn't crash. And then your actual save game script, the most important thing is make sure you change the property to true that it's going to be checking for in the loop, save your game, and then immediately set it to false afterwards, so that way you can continue playing the game without your while loop doing its thing, even though you haven't loaded the game yet. You're just trying to continue playing it after you saved it. Okay, so that's what this does. It stops it interfering until you load the game. So that's all you really need to do to implement it. You don't need to do anything to the load game scripts. You simply just need load game. Okay, for this mechanic to work, it will work with the existing load game command. That's all load game has to do, because this will just work when you load game. Okay, so with that said, I'll wrap up this video. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out in the Discord. I'll be happy to go over anything you might be unsure about. But for now, that'll wrap up this video. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next tutorial.